By 2010, everyone in the retail industry already knew RadioShack was dead. Not struggling, not declining, dead. The business model didn't work anymore. The stores were too small, too outdated, selling products nobody needed from a chain that used to sell everything. Analysts wrote about it. Employees felt it. Customers had already left. So here's the question that nobody actually answers when they tell this story. If everyone already knew it was over in 2010, why did it take RadioShack until February 2015 to file for bankruptcy? And why, after that bankruptcy was supposed to fix things, did the company file for bankruptcy again in 2017? 7 years, 2 bankruptcies, thousands of jobs lost slowly instead of all at once. There's a reason for that gap, and it's not the reason you'd expect. It's not denial. It's not bad management. Well, not only that. It's a $250 million loan with one clause buried inside it. A clause that made it illegal, legally illegal, for RadioShack to do the one thing it needed to do to survive. I'm going to show you exactly what that clause said, and why it turned a company that should have died quickly into something far stranger.
Here's a number that should bother you. RadioShack reported 11 consecutive quarterly losses before it finally filed for bankruptcy. 11 in a row. That's not a company having a bad year. That's a company that has been functionally dead for almost 3 years, still opening its doors every morning, still paying its employees, still ordering inventory, while everyone inside and outside the building already knew how the story ended. And here's the part that almost nobody talks about. When RadioShack finally did file for Chapter 11 in February 2015, it didn't disappear. It came back, reorganized, sold to a hedge fund, partnered with a wireless carrier. And then 2 years later, in March 2017, it filed for bankruptcy again. Twice in a little over 2 years. This video isn't really about smartphones killing RadioShack, even though they did. It's about something more interesting. How a dying company can be kept alive past the point where dying would have been merciful, and who benefits when that happens.
To understand how strange RadioShack's death was, you need to understand how strange its life was, too. 1921, Boston, Massachusetts. 2 brothers, Theodore and Milton Deutschman, opened a small shop. They were passionate about amateur radio, ham radios, the kind of hobby that required obscure parts nobody else sold. They called the shop RadioShack, a reference to the small wooden structures on ships that housed radio equipment. For decades, it stayed small, a niche retailer for hobbyists. Vacuum tubes, resistors, the kind of components only a certain type of person would even know to look for. Then, in 1962, the company was nearly bankrupt. 8 stores, barely surviving. A Texas leather goods businessman named Charles Tandy bought it for $300,000. And Tandy did something that changed everything. He shut down the unprofitable mail order business, streamlined the product line, and started opening small retail stores in shopping centers, staffed by people who actually understood electronics. It worked. By the mid-1970s, RadioShack was opening 2 new stores every single working day. 2 stores every day. The 1980s and 1990s were RadioShack's golden era. The company's own advertising called itself the biggest name in little computers, and for a while, that wasn't an exaggeration. RadioShack expanded into wireless phones. Cellular technology was new, confusing, and intimidating to most consumers, and RadioShack stores, staffed by knowledgeable salespeople, became the place where ordinary people learned how this new technology worked. By 1999, the company hit its absolute peak,
Over 8,000 stores across the United States, Mexico, and Canada, plus international locations under the Tandy name in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, France, the UK, and Australia. 8,000 stores, annual sales exceeding $4 billion. This was a company that had successfully reinvented itself multiple times, from ham radio parts to home computers to wireless phones. Each time, RadioShack found the next wave of consumer electronics and put itself at the center of it. If you wanted to know how anything electronic worked in 1995, you went to RadioShack and asked. That's a remarkable position to be in. It's also, as we're about to see, an incredibly dangerous one, because once you've successfully pivoted 3 times, you start to believe you can pivot forever. And that belief is exactly what stops you from seeing the pivot you can't make.
So what went wrong? The easy answer is smartphones, and that's true as far as it goes. When the iPhone launched in 2007, it didn't just create a new product category. It quietly destroyed the entire reason RadioShack's small format stores existed. Think about what RadioShack actually sold: batteries, cables, chargers, small electronic components, and increasingly cell phones and accessories. The smartphone made an enormous percentage of that inventory irrelevant. You didn't need a separate calculator, camera, voice recorder, GPS device, or flashlight anymore. Your phone did all of it. And the phones themselves? Increasingly, people bought those directly from carriers, Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, or from big box stores like Best Buy that could offer better selection and better prices because of their scale. RadioShack's stores were small. That had been an advantage for decades. Convenient, accessible, in every strip mall in America. Now, it was a liability. A small store can't compete on selection. A small store can't compete on price because it doesn't have the buying power of a Best Buy or an Amazon warehouse. By the early 2010s, RadioShack's sales were in steady decline, each year worse than the last. Here's the thing about retail decline, though. It's rarely sudden. It's slow. A few percentage points of revenue lost per year. A few more stores becoming unprofitable. A management team that keeps believing the next product cycle, the next marketing campaign, the next store redesign will turn things around. In 2013,
In 2013, RadioShack took out a $250 million loan from a firm called Salus Capital Partners. On paper, this looked like a lifeline. Cash to fund the turnaround plan. Cash to keep the lights on while the new strategy took hold. But the loan came with a condition, a specific, contractually binding restriction. RadioShack was only allowed to close 200 underperforming stores per year. 200 per year, no matter how bad things got. Now, on the surface, that might sound like a reasonable safeguard. Salus wanted to make sure RadioShack didn't liquidate itself into oblivion and leave the lender holding nothing. But here's the problem. RadioShack didn't have a "some stores are underperforming" problem. It had a "most of these 4,300 stores should never have existed in this format" problem. Retail experts who looked at RadioShack's situation in 2013 and 2014 generally agreed. The company needed to close somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 stores quickly to have any chance of survival, concentrate resources, cut the bleeding, focus on the locations that could actually be profitable. The loan agreement made that legally impossible. 200 stores a year meant that even if RadioShack's management had wanted to make the hard, fast decision, the decision that might have actually saved the company, they couldn't, not without violating the loan covenant, which would have triggered default, which would have been even worse. Think about what that actually means in practice. A company that everyone agrees is dying and that knows roughly what medicine it needs to survive is contractually forbidden from taking the full dose. It
So now you understand the trap. RadioShack knew what it needed to do. It legally couldn't do it. And every quarter that passed made the eventual outcome worse. But here's what I promised you at the start, and this is the part of the story that gets even stranger. Bankruptcy didn't end this. It just changed who was pulling the strings. What happened after the first bankruptcy filing is, in some ways, even more revealing about how dying companies actually work in modern finance. Stay with me. By late 2014, the math had become undeniable. RadioShack had reported 11 consecutive quarterly losses. Holiday sales in both 2013 and 2014 had been disastrous, the two seasons that matter most for retail, and the company had failed both. On February 5, 2015, RadioShack was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. Days later, it filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company had accumulated over $1 billion in debt. Here's where the story takes its first genuinely strange turn. Standard General, a hedge fund, had been one of RadioShack's creditors. Through the bankruptcy process, Standard General formed a new entity called General Wireless Operations and acquired RadioShack's brand, trademark, and roughly 1,740 of its best remaining stores. The price? $26.2 million. For a brand that 15 years earlier had operated 8,000 stores and generated over $4 billion in annual sales. $26.2 million. And here's the part that should make you pause. A hedge fund that had loaned RadioShack money and benefited from the interest payments while the company struggled ended up owning the company's most valuable remaining assets at a fraction of their historical worth through the bankruptcy process that the company's own debt structure had helped cause. This is not illegal. It's not even unusual in modern corporate finance. Distressed debt investors specialize in exactly this, buying the debt of struggling companies cheaply, then converting that debt into ownership when the company can't pay. But it does raise an uncomfortable question. Whose interests was that 200-store closure clause actually protecting back in 2013? RadioShack's chance at survival, or the lender's chance at eventually owning the carcass for pennies on the dollar? I'm not going to tell you the answer is definitely the second one. I don't have access to Salus Capital's internal deliberations. But I will tell you that the way this played out, slow bleed followed by a fire sale to a creditor, is a pattern that shows up again and again in corporate bankruptcies. And it's worth knowing the pattern exists.
As part of the reorganization, General Wireless made a deal with Sprint. The idea? Convert many of the surviving RadioShack stores into co-branded locations. Sprint Store at RadioShack. Sprint would sell phones and wireless plans inside RadioShack's retail footprint. RadioShack would get foot traffic and a partner with deep pockets. On paper, this looked like exactly the kind of partnership that could work. RadioShack had real estate and brand recognition. Sprint had products people actually wanted to buy. About 1,750 stores were converted into this co-branded format. It didn't work the way anyone hoped. RadioShack's CEO, Dean Rogers, would later say the Sprint partnership proved not as profitable as expected. That's corporate language for the deal that was supposed to save the company quietly failed to deliver. Sprint itself was dealing with its own struggles during this period. Wireless subscriber losses, network performance problems, fierce competition from Verizon and AT&T. A company fighting its own battles isn't always the ideal partner for a retailer trying to be resurrected. By late 2016, the warning signs were back. Mobility sales, phones, plans, accessories, the entire reason the Sprint partnership existed, were performing far worse than projected. History, it turned out, doesn't always wait very long to repeat itself.
March 8, 2017. A little over 2 years after the first bankruptcy filing, General Wireless Operations, the entity that owned RadioShack, filed for Chapter 11 again.
This time, the company announced it would close approximately 200 more stores immediately and evaluate the fate of its remaining 1,300 locations. Sprint announced it would convert several hundred of the shared stores into Sprint-only corporate locations, effectively absorbing the real estate and abandoning the RadioShack partnership. RadioShack creditors later alleged that Sprint's actions in this period led to nearly 6,000 lost jobs as stores closed. By the time the second bankruptcy process concluded, the numbers told the real story. RadioShack had gone from 4,400 stores and 21,000 employees at its first bankruptcy in 2015 to a company planning to keep, at most, 28 company-owned stores. 28. The reorganized company that emerged would exist primarily as an e-commerce website and a network of roughly 425 independent licensed dealers, small business owners using the RadioShack name and supply chain, but operating their own individual stores. The brand survived. The company, in any meaningful sense, did not.
So let's go back to the question I asked at the beginning. If everyone knew RadioShack was dying in 2010, why did it take until 2015 to file bankruptcy and 2017 to actually finish dying? The honest answer isn't denial, even though there was plenty of that. The honest answer is a $250 million loan with a clause that limited store closures to 200 per year made it financially and legally impossible for RadioShack to take the decisive action it needed to take when it still might have mattered. By the time the company was free to do what it should have done in 2013, the value that remained had shrunk to almost nothing. $26.2 million for a brand that once generated $4 billion in annual sales. There's a broader lesson here that goes beyond RadioShack. When a struggling company takes on rescue financing, the terms of that financing matter just as much as the amount. A loan that's supposed to buy time can, if structured the wrong way or the right way, depending on whose interests you're protecting, actually make the underlying problem worse while protecting the lender's ability to recover value later. RadioShack's slow death wasn't really about smartphones. Smartphones explain why the company needed to change. The Salus Capital loan explains why it couldn't change fast enough to survive. Write me in the comments. Did you have a RadioShack near you growing up? What do you remember buying there? I have a feeling a lot of you are about to tell me about a TRS-80, or a walkie-talkie, or that one weird cable that only RadioShack seemed to carry. A company that built one of the first personal computers in history. A company that taught a generation of Americans how electronics worked. Took almost a decade to finish dying, not because nobody saw it coming, but because the terms of its own rescue made a fast death impossible. That's the story of RadioShack, and it won't be the last time a rescue makes things worse. If you learned something you didn't expect from this one about how dying companies actually work behind the scenes, that's exactly what this channel is for. Every week, we go inside the collapses that explain more about how business really works than any case study ever could. Subscribe. The next one is already coming.